All they talk about is that CO2 is going to make the world too hot for life in 10, 20, 30 years. This is not true.
If carbon dioxide isn't bad, then is there actually anything that's making the climate rise? Or is that just a lie?
Life is somewhere between 3.5 and 3.8 billion years old. But let's just look at the last 500 million years. During that time, the climate has changed dramatically on a number of occasions. There's been 3 ice ages in the last 500 million years, and we are in one of them now. One of the great ironies about the climate is getting too warm narrative is that we're actually in one of the coldest periods in the last 500 million years right now. This is the Pleistocene Ice Age. Only we are in an interglacial period, which is a slightly warmer period that occurs in between major glaciations. Now, major glaciations don't make a lot of sense in Australia because I don't think you've ever been major glaciated because you're in a warmer part than much of the world and surrounded by ocean. But during the last major glaciation, which peaked 20,000 years ago, the whole of Canada was covered in a sheet of ice over a mile deep. The whole of Canada, which is bigger than Australia. But it melted. And now we're in an interglacial period. There's been 45 interglacial periods in the Pleistocene Ice Age and 45 major glaciations. So people get confused that the last major glaciation was the end of the Ice Age, coming to now. No, there's been 45 of those, long before humans existed. The Pleistocene Ice Age started 2.6 million years ago. The great irony of the world is too hot and CO2 is too high is that the world is colder now than it has been for most of the last 500 million years. And CO2 is lower now during this last major glaciation event and coming into the pre-industrial era, lower than it ever has been in the history of the Earth. CO2 was getting so low during the last major glaciation that it came close to where plants die for lack of it. Carbon dioxide is the main food for all photosynthetic plants, all green plants. Now that would be a good thing about CO2, wouldn't it? How many good things have you heard about CO2 lately? They don't talk about that. All they talk about is that CO2 is going to make the world too hot for life in 10, 20, 30 years. This is not true. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. It is a scare story. Yet, the most important thing about CO2 is it is the main building block, the carbon in CO2, both in the atmosphere and in the ocean, is the source of carbon for all life, not just plant life, because we get our carbon from plant life. Even when we eat an animal, we're eating an animal that ate a plant. All the carbon in all life comes from CO2, and all life is made of that carbon. We are carbon-based life. The other thing is water, H2O, which is not running out like CO2 was. H2O plus CO2 is what plants use to make sugar, glucose, the energy for all life. Those two molecules, carbon dioxide and water, are the building blocks of life. Everything else, the essential nutrients and iron and the other calcium and phosphorus, those are essential nutrients that are needed for life too. But the main process is photosynthetic, energy from the sun, chlorophyll in the green leaf, making sugar with carbon dioxide and water. That is the basis of life being here on Earth. And that is not being emphasized enough in the schools these days. Everybody's talking about CO2 as if it were a poison, when in fact it is the main substance for life.
Who has heard bad things about CO2?
Interesting, because in my belief there is nothing bad about CO2. It is 100% beneficial. CO2 couldn't have been responsible during the first 150 years of those 300 years during which the Earth has been warming, because we weren't putting out any CO2 of any substance until about 1850. And if you talk to people who are in the climate catastrophe, climate alarmism, climate emergency category, they don't care about anything that happened before 1850. Because the things that happened before 1850 completely blow their hypothesis out of the water. You see, the temperature was warmer than it is today during the first 5,000 years of this interglacial period, when CO2 was much lower than it is today. The temperature has not responded to the rather large increase in CO2 that has occurred in the atmosphere due to our emissions from fossil fuels. Now, where do you think the fossil fuels came from?
Dead animals and plants.
Well, good for you. You know that. The coal came from forests on the land that got buried, and the oil and gas came from marine creatures that got buried in the sediments of the ocean. Many of those sediments have come onto the land because of the plate of the crust of the Earth moving, and so now we can get that oil and gas on land that used to be the ocean bottom. So yes, all of the fossil fuels came from life. And yet we are calling them dirty and polluting and every other bad thing, and also saying that the CO2 from them is virtually toxic because it's going to cause the Earth to come to an end, or whatever the Earth's end looks like. I've never been quite clear about that. The truth of the matter is all the CO2 that we are emitting from burning fossil fuels came out of the atmosphere and the ocean in the first place. That's where it used to be. The plants used it to make themselves, the trees and the creatures in the ocean, and then it got locked up in sediments. The scientists call that sequestered, but really it's locked up. It's no longer in circulation, because the carbon in circulation is in circulation between the living things, the soils, the atmosphere, and the ocean. That carbon is moving around all the time. When plants die, they give off CO2. When plants grow, they absorb CO2. The soils contain a lot of carbon, all of which was made by the plants. People think plants eat soil. No, plants make soil. I've written a new book. Its title is Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. The theme of the book, listen carefully to this. Nearly all the scare stories today, whether it's about CO2 or radiation or coral reefs or polar bears or GMOs, are based on things that are either invisible or so remote that the average person cannot check it for themselves, cannot observe it for themselves. You cannot observe what CO2 is doing. You cannot observe what radiation is doing because it's invisible. You cannot observe the polar bears because they're on the North Pole. You cannot observe the coral reefs directly because they're underwater and way offshore. So a few people get to see small parts of them, but very few people get to fly over them in airplanes and map them and determine the whole situation. So when things are invisible or remote, you see, the very basics of science, the beginning of science is observation. Religion's different. In religion, we're asked to believe in something we've never seen. But in science, we're required to see something before we can believe in it. And we can't see what CO2 is doing. You just can't. It's invisible, it's tasteless, it's colorless, it's odorless.
Is there any other type of the pollution stories that are true, or is it all just lies? Because there are a few other ones.
It's pollution. It's like smoke from burning, not burning cleanly. It's like pollution from impurities like sulfur dioxide and soot. Yes, there is, of course, pollution, water pollution and air pollution. But we have really, dealt with most of it. Now, you got a lot of pollution from those forest fires you had there in your summer, and we could talk about that because that's not caused by CO2 or climate change either. It's caused because the Greens in the city have got control over the management of the landscapes where they don't even live and don't even have a clue about the ecology and how it works. The Aboriginal people used the fire stick when the land was still moist and not so hot in the spring, and would burn then to get rid of the fuel load so that if a fire did start, it wouldn't be so severe. They had 60,000 years to learn that. The Europeans and others who came since then have not had as long, and they don't seem to be willing to adopt the wisdom of the first peoples. The same thing is true here in North America. These big fires in California, I've been to Australia a lot, so I know your forests inside and out. But these fires that are happening, you can never stop forest fires altogether because there's lightning, for one thing. And then there's idiots who leave fires going and throw cigarette butts out the window. But at least you can make the fires less severe and less frequent by managing the land properly. So there's much to talk about forests. And I'd love to do that again someday when we have a little bit longer. Thanks, everybody. I thought your questions were very good. I really enjoyed it. Bye. See you again.
In my school, there's sometimes whole hours that we spend in a day talking about climate change, and just learning that it isn't actually what I know it or knew it was is kind of surprising.
The video you just watched is for a new education platform called True Arrow Academy of Critical Thinking, or TACT for short. TACT will be an alternative education resource platform that's non-woke and non-indoctrinating, with each lesson being a potential turning point in a young learner's understanding on a range of important topics. TACT will evolve into many hundreds of animations and filmed lessons written, run and influenced by an exceptional mix of academic heavyweights teaching against the grain, with lessons encouraging open discussion, critical thinking and debate. TACT's duty of care is to arm and shield youth against modern, subversive, mainstream education. Supporters will be the lifeblood of TACT. If you would like to support this project, let's build this together at givesendgo.com/TACT. Thank you so much.